Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. It's time, once again, for another depressing dose of dismal Disney. Let's talk about the Marvels. In spite of there already being a very crowded set of superhero movies released this year, the next superhero movie that will open in theaters next month will be this year's 7th superhero movie, as well as the 33rd MCU movie. Yes, you heard me right. MCU movie number 33. And based on the newest predictions for the movie's opening weekend box office, domestically, The Marvels is probably only going to earn somewhere between $50 million to $75 million. And no, I'm not joking. So what exactly does this mean for the movie? Currently, there are a total of 5 MCU movies that have domestic opening weekend box office earnings that are less than $75 million. And the one that has the lowest domestic opening weekend box office is 2008's The Incredible Hulk, which only earned around $55.4 million. So if The Marvels fails to earn at least $55.4 million domestically during its opening weekend next month, it will earn the dubious title of having the lowest domestic opening weekend box office for the entire MCU franchise. The MCU movie with the second lowest domestic opening weekend box office is 2015's Ant-Man at $57.2 million. And the other 3 movies that are part of this lowest domestic opening weekend box office group include 2011's Thor, 2011's Captain America: The First Avenger, and 2021's Eternals, which earned around $71.3 million for its domestic opening weekend box office. As it turns out, 4 of these 5 movies have domestic opening weekend box office earnings that are more than 1 standard deviation away from the franchise average of roughly $135.3 million. This histogram chart separates the current 32 MCU movies based on their domestic opening weekend box office revenues into bins separated by $10 million each. The vast majority of the MCU's movies are within 1 standard deviation of the franchise average, as illustrated by this next chart, which shows the number of movies within each of the specified ranges of standard deviations. The only one of the 5 MCU movies with the lowest domestic opening weekend box office revenue that is within 1 standard deviation of the franchise average was 2021's Eternals with its $71.3 million. So the lower 2/3 of the predicted $50 million to $75 million domestic opening weekend for The Marvels is actually more than 1 standard deviation away from the overall franchise average, as is the range's $62.5 million midpoint, which has the highest probability of occurring within that range. And what this says is that there is very little interest within the general public to see this movie. Now, looking again at those 5 existing MCU movies whose domestic opening weekend box office is within the predicted range for The Marvels, 2 of those existing movies failed to break even: 2008's The Incredible Hulk and 2021's Eternals. And those 2 movies share one more thing in common that the other 3 that did break even don't. Their average weekly drops were over 41%. The average weekly drop in box office for 2008's The Incredible Hulk was 41.11%, and for 2021's Eternals, it was 43.24%, which was worse. For the 3 movies that did break even, their average weekly drops were below 40%. Now, while the production budget for The Incredible Hulk was only $137.5 million, its domestic share ended up being 50.76%, which was also a contributing factor to why it failed to break even, in addition to its very low domestic opening weekend box office. In the case of Eternals, its production budget was much higher at $200 million, but even though its domestic share was a very reasonable 41.04%, it ended up losing around $20 million more at the box office than 2008's The Incredible Hulk did. And guess what? As this next chart shows, The Marvels has a significantly higher production budget than Eternals at $274.8 million. And that's the fourth highest production budget for all 33 MCU movies to date, and it's also the highest since 2019's Avengers Endgame. And there are 10 MCU movies separating Endgame from the Marvels. So let's project what the final domestic box office for the Marvels might be. And we'll do that by using the MCU's overall average weekly drop of 37.66% as the center point, and one standard deviation above and below as the other points to establish a potential likely range for the movie's final domestic box office. And those other points are at 31.94% to 43.42%. Now, given that the predicted domestic box office opening range is between $50 million to $75 million, as I said earlier in the video, the most likely value would probably be the midpoint, which would be $62.5 million. So using a predicted domestic opening weekend box office of $62.5 million and a possible range of average weekly drops from 31.94% to 43.42%, we get the following possible range of final domestic box office values for the Marvels as follows: $143.9 million at the lower range, $165.8 million at the mid-range, and $195.5 million at the upper range. And we'll take those final domestic box office values to calculate a possible range of final global gross box office values for the movie by using a range of possible domestic shares that are one standard deviation above and below the overall average MCU domestic share of 41.43%. With an overall MCU domestic share standard deviation of 6.99%, the range of possible domestic shares that we'll use will be from 34.44% to 48.42%. And the result is as follows. The final global gross box office for the Marvels may range somewhere between $297.2 million to $567.7 million, which is a rather wide range, but the most likely value might be close to the one calculated based on the MCU's overall average weekly drop and overall average domestic share. And that value might be $400.3 million, which is a rather low number for a movie whose production budget is reported to be $274.8 million. Now that we know what the movie's possible final global gross box office numbers might be, we can also estimate a break-even point range by multiplying the movie's $274.8 million production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively, to account for the 50% of gross ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. And when we do that, we get an estimated break-even point range of $687 million to $824.4 million, which is, quite a bit higher than the movie's projected final global gross box office range. In other words, the Marvels, thanks to its very low predicted domestic opening weekend box office and its bloated production budget, as well as its likely average weekly drops and domestic share, will more than likely flop at the box office. And based on its estimated break-even point range and projected final global gross box office revenue, the Marvels currently stands to lose somewhere between $283.2 million to $527.2 million in global gross box office revenue. And when we divide that range by 2 to account for the 50% that movie theaters keep from the global gross box office ticket sales for themselves, Disney and Marvel Studios may lose somewhere on the order of $141.6 million to $263.6 million. Now, while that won't be enough to unseat The Flash, which is currently the biggest flop for 2023, as I have documented in my Who Will Be the Biggest Flop video series, it may be enough to unseat Indiana Jones and the Dildo of Destruction, which currently sits in second place behind The Flash. As I have suspected for many months that the Marvels will more than likely flop at the box office, I didn't have any numbers that I could use to start projecting possible final global gross box office numbers for the movie until the first opening weekend box office predictions were released. Being a very female-centric movie, it won't appeal that much with those who love superhero movies the most, male audience members within the 18 to 45 demographic. Those pushing woke identity politics and feminist messaging in superhero movies are completely out of touch not only with the public at large, but with the main consumer of movies such as these. They also fail to take into account that most countries outside of the US are not as pluralistic, so diversity, inclusion, and feminist messaging geared towards US audiences will be even less popular and draw even smaller audiences in movie markets outside of the US. So the intent is very clear that Disney and Marvel Studios spent $274.8 million to produce the Marvels to push an agenda far more than it was intended to entertain. And consequently, it's going to flop and very likely be counted among the biggest flops of 2023. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.